So I'd like to welcome everybody to this session 6 of the MyKludo virtual symposium on mental health and investigations. So our final session today is on vicarious trauma and self-care, and I'm going to be delivering that myself. So for those of you who are not familiar with me or missed the first session this morning, I'm the founder and CEO of MyKludo, and I've been in the investigations business now for about 30 years, serving initially as a police officer both in the UK and in the Australian Federal Police, before setting up one of Australia's premium workplace investigation businesses back in 2001. So I was also a lecturer in policing in investigations for a number of years at Charles Sturt University, and I hold a number of qualifications, including a master's in forensic psychology and degrees in social sciences. But as I said in the previous session, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so my understanding of psychology has its limits. So last year, just as COVID broke, we founded MyKludo as a startup enterprise. And one of its main pillars is around improving the accessibility of professional development for experienced investigators, and also the delivery of improvement of the quality to the delivery of investigation services. So aside from my professional experience as an investigator and a training provider for those past 30 years, not sure where they went, I have no particular experience in vicarious trauma. I have a bunch of personal experiences, and I'm really acting today as a curator of the knowledge around what we have in this space as it applies to the investigations industry. I didn't think that we could deliver the symposium without addressing vicarious trauma, and so I hope that the information is kind of a taster as to what it is, where we go with it, and what areas still need to be worked on and considered when you work in this space. So from the people who are at the symposium today, some of you work for employers, some of those are large government organisations, and others of you work for yourselves. And some of you are also employers. So there's messages in this material for employers who are responsible for others. There's messages for people who are part of large organisations. And importantly, there are strategies for people who work for themselves, because that's easy for that group to be forgotten. So I've got one chat message up, so I'm just going to read it. And that's from Debbie, so saying thank you for a great day. Well, I'm pleased you're enjoying it so far, and I hope you enjoy this session too. So I'm going to share my screen and share my PowerPoints with you, and yeah, press this button over here. Okay, so as I said, that's not working. Let's try that button. Let's try it again. Okay, so that should all be working now. All right, so that's just my title slide. I think I've covered everything in there. I want to introduce you first up to a few cases that have happened in the last couple of years that really deal with vicarious trauma. And the first one that I want to look at is the settlement by Facebook last year with they had a class action brought against them by Facebook moderators, and they settled that claim to the tune of $52 million, which when I read it sounded like a lot, but then when you read the fine print, what that equates to is that each moderator is going to receive $1,000 to put towards medical expenses for the vicarious trauma that they develop doing that job. So that doesn't sound quite so such a startlingly good offer when you break it down to the individuals. And we will look at what Facebook were doing a little bit later on, and how they were part of the settlement and how they addressed the problem. But one of the problems that Facebook faced was that because there has been a sudden boom in private individuals just recording and videoing whatever material they want. They just post it straight onto Facebook and other social media sources. And so Facebook came under a lot of pressure to moderate that content and to make sure that it was acceptable for other people's consumption. So rather hurriedly, they engaged a number of vendors, a number of providers to hire moderators. So they did that quite quickly. A number of companies were hired. They all hired moderators, many of which were working remotely for not very much money, filtering through the material that our children, our friends, ourselves are posting to Facebook. And needless to say, there wasn't any thought put into the impact that viewing that material may have had on those individuals. So we'll return to the Facebook scenario a bit later. But I also want to talk about this case. This was a Melbourne lawyer who was working for the Office of Public Prosecution when she brought a negligence claim against her employer for failing in their duty of care. And she acquired PTSD and depressive disorders through the vicarious trauma involved in being immersed, if you like, in child exploitation material. So as part of her role, she was put onto a special unit which just did child exploitation, not investigations, but cases. And so she was soaked up in all that material all the time. And one of the features that made this case, made her case worse, was that she was raising young children at the same time as she was doing that work. And that resulted in her experiencing PTSD and depressive-like symptoms. Now, the judge in this case explained that those risks were foreseeable, and as a consequence, the damages were paid. They also identified that as a workplace, they should have been looking out for red flags, and will be looking more at red flags and what employers can do to assist with vicarious trauma a bit later on in the presentation. Now, the third case is not a lawyer, not an investigator. They're a journalist. Now, this also happened in 2019, and it was a journalist working for the Age newspaper in Melbourne, and she was awarded $180,000 in damages after developing PTSD whilst she worked as a crime reporter for 10 years. Now, I'm going to play you a bit of an audio recording, so long as my technology works, which it should. I'm just going to play you 5-6 minutes of this session. If you have any problem with the audio, somebody could send me a message and then we can check that.
Now, you don't become an astute crime reporter like John Sylvester without spending many years exposing yourself to an ugly world of violence and death. By sheer coincidence, the Victorian County Court has just handed down a world-first legal decision. Judge Chris O'Neill awarded $180,000 in damages to a former Age newspaper journalist who suffered PTSD while working as a crime reporter. The judge found the Age was negligent because it failed to provide the journalist with a safe workplace. Bree Canusta is managing partner with Advice Line Injury Lawyers. Bree acted for the journalist, who's only identified as YZ.
She was someone who wanted to be a journalist from a very young age and worked her way up really through the ranks with the aspiration to work for a paper like The Age. She was an outstanding reporter, and that's not just because I say that because she was my client, but that was the evidence of everyone who had worked with her, who gave evidence in the case, whether they be for her or for The Age. And she initially was working as a crime reporter, and after some real challenges doing that work, did a short stint in sport before she was really forced into the Supreme Court reporting role in 2010.
So she arrived at The Age, I think, in 2003, and she worked there for about 10 years until she took a voluntary redundancy in about 2013.
That's right.
So let's talk about the kinds of crime that she covered. Melbourne's gangland war,
Yes,
road deaths,
yes,
police shootings,
yes,
the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires.
yes.
And in 2009, 4-year-old Darcy Freeman, who was thrown off Melbourne's Westgate Bridge by her father, a very traumatic crime, no doubt for the media, but also for the city generally. How close did she get to these crimes? What kind of exposure did she have as a result of covering these kinds of issues?
What's interesting is that we all remember this period of time in Melbourne, particularly because there was so much gangland activity and there were a number of high profile incidents that occurred. And then we had Black Saturday, and then we have the Darcy Freeman case.
About a month later after Black Saturday.
That's right. And these types of things, we almost remember where we were on these days. And so they are traumatic for us as observers. And then we have the role of the journalist and what my client YZ did, which was attend very quickly a lot of these scenes after these incidents had occurred. She witnessed Darcy's body being brought out of the water, and she was on site after many of these incidents, sometimes before police officers had arrived, sometimes before ambulance officers had arrived. So she would see the grief of the family, and she was extremely close to it.
So how did this sort of work affect her?
Work like this, it's not just one story. It is the cumulative effect of covering traumatic stories day in, day out. What was so remarkable about this client is that she would be there on the day that something happened. She ultimately then ended up following the court case. The families trusted her and often confided in her, so she became intimately involved in the story. And she just did that day in, day out. As a result of that, her sleep became affected, her personality became affected. She needed to seek medical treatment, and she tried to cope with it as best she could privately, but it caused parts of her personal life, sadly, to unravel. And she was trying to pick up the pieces as best she could and be a fabulous reporter at the same time.
So essentially she had mental health consequences from the work.
Yes.
Did she communicate her distress to her employers and her workmates?
She did, and her workmates gave evidence that they were aware of the difficulties that she was experiencing. Until the trial, she didn't know that some of her workmates had in fact approached senior managers at the Age to raise their concern about her with them. That still didn't prompt a response. She herself spoke directly to managers about her own experience and her need for support. At the same time, she was agitating for change in the workplace, for greater trauma awareness, for peer support programs, for the benefit of the people that worked with her.
And what did the court find was her employer's response when she raised these concerns or agitated for this kind of change, either to her own situation or to those of others?
The court found that the response was wholly inadequate. A witness from the Age said that from 2002, he knew of the risk to journalists of suffering a psychological injury because of the exposure to trauma that they experienced, and that he very much wanted to implement change, but that due to financial reasons or restraints, that wasn't prioritised.
I understand at some point, I think actually, in fact, after covering the Darcy Freeman murder, your client sought to be transferred away from crime reporting, and I think she was transferred into the sports department there for a while. What happened after that? That was in 2009, right?
Yeah, so she came back from being on the Westgate and seeing what she saw, and she said to the news desk, "I've had enough of death and destruction." And they knew what she meant, and she was offered an opportunity to work in sport for a year. And she did a great job. But then in April 2010, she was told she was moving to cover the Supreme Court round. And she said on 3 occasions, "I don't want to do that. And you know why." And it was ultimately pressed upon her that she must.
And I should point out that the Supreme Court round means sitting in a courtroom. It doesn't mean attending a crime scene, though.
Correct. It involves sitting in a courtroom and covering the most serious events that take place in the Supreme Court, which are, for the most part, murder trials.
Your client left, I think, in 2013. She commenced this civil litigation. There was a 3-week trial, and recently the county court has awarded her $180,000 in damages. What do you say her employer could have done to avoid being held liable for her PTSD?
The research says that peer support programs and trauma awareness training is critical and works well at preventing the onset of psychological injuries, or works well to ameliorate the intensity of those symptoms for journalists. We have organisations in Australia to implement programs like that. The Age knew of those programs. They had been told about them, they'd been invited to engage, but whilst there was some small training offered to editors, it wasn't throughout the workplace.
So we're just going to stop that audio there. And I think listening to that reporting covering how the Age was negligent in terms of not listening, but also very important listening to the types of symptoms and the actions that may be effective in assisting people after they've developed vicarious trauma. So there we go. If we look at the history of our awareness of vicarious trauma, I think this has some relevance to us because these cases only occurred in the last couple of years. But people have been studying vicarious trauma for the past 30 years. Initially, it was identified as an impact on therapists and people who were working in a deep therapeutic relationship with clients who have experienced trauma. So therapists, social workers, it was then identified that certain healthcare providers and healthcare workers could also be influenced by the trauma of people that they were caring for, and first responders. It's typically associated where you're building a close relationship with the person who has experienced that trauma. But it's more recently that we're discovering that people like lawyers and the judiciary experience this similar impacts from trauma, journalists, and one of the latest studies that I read relates to an emerging understanding that forensic scientists are vulnerable to the same influences. So in this session, I'm going to really cover what is vicarious trauma, who can get it, although I've just given you a list, what are the signs and symptoms, what employers can do to reduce the risk, what are some of the tools for support, and we're going to have a look and maybe put together, depending on time, an emergency self-care plan, which is a tool that's been developed and been found to be helpful in terms of managing your own risks. So what is vicarious trauma? So this is a particular form of trauma that occurs when somebody has repeated exposure to other people's trauma. It's distinct from other forms of stresses, which I will look at shortly, because it is a cumulative impact and it has this negative transformational impact on the person who experiences vicarious trauma. So to the point where the impact on their mental health intrudes on daily life, and critically it changes. So it's a type of trauma that fundamentally changes the character and belief system of the person who is suffering from it. And this is slightly different from other forms of work-related stress, which are also important, but not quite the same. So we also have secondary traumatic stress, which is where the person may develop sort of PTSD-like symptoms following the experience of a traumatic event that they haven't personally witnessed. But these symptoms can often appear quite suddenly and are specifically tied to an event experienced by the person that they're caring for. There's also compassion fatigue, which is more like an emotional residue from providing support over a long period of time to multiple people. And there's burnout, which is more closely aligned to a type of exhaustion, both emotional and psychological, and tends to be the result of poor work practices, poor shift arrangements, or just plain out too much work. So for lay people, it can be difficult to distinguish between these four different conditions, obviously, if you're dealing with a case, each of these conditions would need a proper diagnosis by a psychologist. But in terms of managing the risks and identifying stresses in yourself, all of these four conditions have crossover elements that you need to be mindful of. There's also the idea of compassion satisfaction. So working in helping roles is not just a negative thing. And in fact, some of the studies have shown quite a contradiction in results where they find that a person is suffering from stress of dealing with trauma, but also a great deal of satisfaction, and people in these professions tend to report very high levels of job satisfaction. They get a lot of personal growth from it, and there's this element of a positive vicarious transformation whereby the helper grows and gains strength from the resilience of others, and through dealing with trauma survivors ends up having a much greater appreciation for their own life and for hope in the face of disaster. So how we're going to respond to trauma individually in any one occasion is a little bit unknown, and obviously that's the work that researchers are looking at to try to help us understand these phenomena. So our experience of trauma, what we do know so far, is that our own individual experience of trauma is very much influenced by the personal events that we have experienced. And these are cumulative over the years. So we find high levels of PTSD and vicarious trauma in first responders because they respond to a whole lot of traumatic incidents that people that are not employed in those roles don't get exposure to. Childhood experiences, so childhood traumatic events, have an influence on us later on in life. And I think we heard some of that, some of the research behind that and the biology behind it from Alison earlier today. So social expectations also impact on how we experience trauma. If we expect ourselves to be able to deal with it, then we're going to have higher levels of coping. Our personal values and the way we were raised, again, that feeds into expectations of ourselves. Global factors have an impact on our experience of trauma. So what's going on in the world? We have war, we have people that have experienced war firsthand, refugees. They cope, they have levels of trauma that I could not even imagine. We also have economic crisis, and at the moment we're in the middle of a pandemic. So all of these factors influence our experience of trauma and how it interacts with us personally. So some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma, there's a big list. So they range sadness, rage, anger, numbness, which we've heard about in other contexts as well, a level of dissociation, shutdown. The main difference with vicarious trauma from the other forms of work-related stress is this disruption to schema and our notions of self and the world. And these disruptions impact in a negative sense around our self-esteem, around intimacy issues, and our sense of control and trust. So you can see how having chronic levels of distrust in people, all situations, has a knock-on effect with how we respond to any given situation, where what we let our children do or don't do, all those things are impacted. This can lead to social isolation, fear of being alone. So there's that distorted sense of safety. And persistent feelings of shame or guilt, that's another one that comes with vicarious trauma. A feeling of hopelessness, as well as this hypervigilance and paranoia. So many of these symptoms we see in other forms of psychological injury, but we do see them here with vicarious trauma. So we can see that there are multiple conditions that, as people that work with people who've experienced trauma, we're vulnerable to. And from a layperson's perspective, I don't think we should expect ourselves to be able to sort out which particular condition we may be experiencing or suffering from. I think what's important is to understand that the work that we do can have an impact on our own mental health, and that recognizing when we need to take some action to prevent any injury becoming more serious or permanent. And the research out there is really about with vicarious trauma is that prevention is the key. So effective management of those vulnerabilities are key to prevention. So what are the risks? Well, we have heard from other presenters during the day that previous history of trauma is certainly a risk to falling vulnerable again. Personality type can create a risk. Gender can create a risk, and also the nature of how we arrange our work, so shift work or intensive work schedules or immersive work. So I think with the lawyer in Victoria, she was only doing that one type of work. So if you're only dealing with cases of child sexual abuse material, it's going to become, the risk of it becoming overwhelming is much greater than if it's one case in 10. So varying the workloads of people so that they get a range of different levels of exposure is beneficial. But the research does say that the only actual predictor of the risk is exposure to traumatic material or accounts of trauma. So whilst these other elements may play a part, they're not proven to be directly correlated as of yet. So how do we manage vicarious trauma? So Jackie Burke is a clinical psychologist who works in Sydney, and I was hoping that she would be able to present for us today, but that wasn't possible. She runs a practice that specialises in vicarious trauma and providing training and support for organisations in that space. So obviously, now we know about vicarious trauma, employers have a work health and safety obligation to manage that hazard. So I guess the first step is recognising, do your workers do work that presents a risk of vicarious trauma? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you have an obligation to manage that hazard. The legislation also requires that workers take reasonable steps to interact and to reduce that hazard as well. So there needs to be something there. But importantly, Jackie emphasises that it is a multi-pronged approach, which is the best approach to reducing the risk. And you can't rely, as an employer, you can't rely on self-care alone. It's not sufficient to remove that risk. So what she advocates that does work. So strategies that do work for employers are around providing education about what vicarious trauma is and what it isn't. So making that distinction between actual trauma where your fundamental perspective on life is altered because of the work that you do, and other conditions like burnout where you may just need a break. So there's that difference in what it is and also how to treat it as a result. Programs that help workers process the work at work and not take it home with them, those are very beneficial. Obviously, now with COVID and working from home, that's a very challenging step in itself, to provide those peer networks within your working network rather than at your home base. She also advocates monitoring the development of vicarious trauma through psychometrics. And we will look at, there are some other self-test strategies, but psychometric testing, so regularly having your workforce assessed by psychologists for signs, developing signs of vicarious trauma, can be helpful. And then we have obviously early strategies to respond. And she stresses the fact that approaches need to be tailored to a particular workforce and to individual needs. So because each individual interacts with trauma in a different way, because of their past experiences, you may need to tailor the approaches to very much to the individual needs of a person rather than to a team or to a job. So let's have a look at what Facebook did. So in part of their $52 million settlement was to enter into arrangements that would provide some protection for their workforce. So they're still employees who were employed by third-party contract companies, but Facebook have the ability to build into some contractual obligations when people are being employed as moderators. So what they're developing this year is software that will mean that when they're viewing material, the material is automatically muted and delivered in black and white to dim down the impact of the distressing material that they might be viewing. They have to agree to conduct weekly one-on-one coaching with all of their moderators. Staff exhibiting mental health problems have access to a counsellor. Now, in most workplaces in Australia, that would be something that's almost taken for granted, but obviously not everywhere in the world has the same level of service or employment legislation framework, call it what you like. They don't have that level of care. And if once you take your employer's responsibility and you outsource it to a third party, the smaller the company, the less able they are to provide those conditions. So access to a counsellor when necessary. They have monthly peer review, peer sessions, group sessions to build up that sense of community amongst the staff. They've also started to screen for resilience on recruitment. So that's assessing future employees on their existing level of resilience before they come into that job. And resilience, if you remember back to this morning, is a key predictor of whether you'll develop a mental illness at some point in your life. The other things that Facebook moderators have is right in front of them every day on their workstation. They have information about how to access psychological support if they need it. They also have information about how to lodge complaints about their employers, and that's to do with the contractual arrangement, so that Facebook minimize their liability later on. So all these strategies are good. They're evidence-based strategies that should work to reduce the impact of trauma on their workers. I wanted to highlight this thing about resilience because I personally find it really interesting. We know that pre-existing levels of resilience impact on our likelihood and severity of developing a mental illness. But we also know that experiencing bullying, harassment, being exposed to a large amount of traumatic material is going to reduce that resilience. So it isn't just about how resilient is the person when they take up the job, and resilience isn't about being strong and not being vulnerable or weak. It is something that we can build on and develop, but it does fluctuate during our lifetime, depending on what else is going on in our lives. So remember, the only real reliable predictor of vicarious trauma is exposure to traumatic material. So I mentioned that there are some tools out there, and I came across a number. This trauma-informed legal practice toolkit is a toolkit that Alison, who spoke to us earlier, this is the same toolkit that she contributed to. And there's a copy of that in the hub up at the top right. If you look in the documents, there's a copy of that document for you to use. Obviously, it relates to legal practice. That's because I haven't come across anything in the space for investigations. So this is a self-assessment tool. So whilst it's not the same as using psychometric testing, it gives some interesting thinking around how we might do that self-assessment for ourselves. And this, I think, is particularly important for people who work in very small businesses or for themselves. So it covers, it has a number of questions that cover 5 domains: behavioral, emotional, spiritual, interpersonal, and professional. And the sorts of questions that are in there are questions like this. So with the behavioral one, it's asking you, do you avoid situations that remind you of stories you've heard at work? Do you notice an increase in your gambling, drug use, cigarette use, or sexual encounters? And in the interpersonal section, do you find yourself chasing perfection? Personally, I've never suffered from that one. And if I did start to suffer from that, I'd be raising some red flags about myself. In the professional area, have you experienced diminished? Oh, that's obviously come out a little bit wrong. Not quite sure what that, so I imagine it says, have you experienced diminished satisfaction from your work? Obviously the slide has come out a little bit incorrect. Can you discuss your concerns towards your work? So these are examples of the sorts of questions. And I fear that these may fall into a little bit of a cheat sheet that was referred to by Greg in the previous session. Having said that, we're not here diagnosing a psychiatric condition. We're here trying to assess ourselves and where we're at in terms of our own personal well-being. So the types of strategies that the that legal trauma-informed legal toolkit refers to. So it lists and goes through a number of the interventions that are found to be useful. So reflection, so that's personal reflection on your cases. Modifying the caseload. So I think one of the significant things about here is that some of the other cases that I read about vicarious trauma is that either there was a very intense caseload of the same sorts of cases, or there was crossover with things that were going on in somebody's personal life. So there was an account I came across for another lawyer actually who'd experienced trauma, and his condition was triggered when he was required to defend a man accused of murdering his 2 sons. The lawyer spoke about it, and the difficulty he had, like he defended, he did his job, and it wasn't really until after he'd finished the case that he realized he was really struggling. But the case had a lot of similarities to his own personal circumstance. So he was recently divorced, he had 2 children about the same age, and he was finding that the similarities and the violence used by the offender just distressing, just straight out distressing for him. So, at that particular time in his life, avoiding cases that have certain characteristics would have been helpful. So, and I know, from investigating historical claims of abuse over many years, as well as current cases of abuse, when I have children, when your children are similar ages, it can often be a trigger if you're managing cases. Not always, not for everybody, but sometimes it is. And I had a case not so long ago that involved a historical complaint of domestic violence, and it brought to the forefront that I had a close family member who'd experienced family violence, completely unknown, for about 20 years. And it made me, having this case to investigate, made me question so many things about how I was interpreting the evidence, how I was interpreting this complainant's account. Why was my response different towards my family member versus this person? And I actually, took that case to a counsellor that I was seeing and discussed how it was impacting. And now when I think about it, that was, obviously it was helpful at the time, but I was processing the details of that case in a safe place with someone that I was able and open to discuss it with. Because often our work we can't discuss with people outside of our work. And if you work on your own, that can make it very difficult. So modifying the caseload and being aware of how your caseload might be impacting on you. Seek organisational support. We don't always know what that needs to be when we ask for it, but if you're in a managerial position, if somebody's asking for it, you need to start looking for ways that you can support them. Individually, incorporating rest and relaxation into day, not always that easy. We will look at some self-care in a moment about some strategies for how you might be able to do that. Seeking informal support, so where you can, reaching out to your existing social network and colleagues for informal support. A bit more formal, discussing cases with colleagues. I love this, enjoying joyful activities. So at some of the most stressful times in my life, I've deliberately sought out joyful activities, and I've found my solace in dancing. So I'm one of the many people on the globe that have taken up dancing because it creates all those positive hormones and helps give you some brightness in your life. Obviously, if things are more serious and more advanced, talking to a GP or a mental health practitioner are important strategies to use. We also get into having mental health plans and managing your own mental health, creating a well-being plan for all different aspects of your life, and committing to reassessing your symptoms, reassessing yourself it recommends a semi-annual basis, so every 6 months. So the essence of that is regularly checking in with yourself to see how you're going. So I'm going to share this slide, and right at the very beginning of the day, we looked at the well-being wheel, and we can see here how well-being wheels are used to remind us to take care of ourselves. So with vicarious trauma, it does impact on all aspects of our life, but if we can intervene early, we can prevent or certainly reduce the impact of that harm. So on this slide, you'll see looking at the different aspects of our lives, there are different strategies that you can take. Some of them are really obvious and we know we do them anyway. And some of them are really tiny, like just taking 10 minutes to make a cup of tea rather than rushing around for that last minute job. Breathing, meditation, relaxation, getting enough sleep, focusing on the people that you're with when you're with them. That can be really hard. Being present, not playing on your phone when you should be talking to your partner or your children. All those things. So I'll leave you to consider all the different aspects of your personal lives and how you can add therapeutic activities into your life that will help your well-being. I've also wanted to mention in this presentation an organisation that I came across called the WOW Self-Care School. So this is I haven't come across an organisation like this before. They are also based in Sydney, so I apologise for those of you who are not based in Sydney. But Kathy Mellico, former journalist, has recently established a self-care school where they deliver training and programs to help people develop self-care. They also work with organisations. She has developed an emergency self-care worksheet, which when I read through it, I thought, actually, this is great because we have mental health care self-plans. We work through our kids with stranger danger plans so that they already have, before they need it, the resources to avoid and how to respond appropriately when potentially bad things happen. And this is much the same. So we won't go into it now, but I did want to show it to you, and there's a copy of the full worksheet in the virtual hub. So if you're interested, you can download that worksheet and prepare one for yourself. I think it's really effective. It really just makes you think about the key questions and where the resources and the people are in your life that can support you when things might be getting a bit rough. So make a list. So the first question is like, make a list of what you can do when you're upset. That will be good for you. So we can normally list these things, but if we have them in a list, we can make ourselves actually do them when we probably don't feel like doing them. There are some other elements of that. What can you do that will help you through the day? So if you have a day when you get up and you really don't actually want to get up or face work, you can remember some things to do. Make lists of people you can contact if you need support or distraction. So this is also the other thing I liked about this was recognizing that not everybody's good for everything. So we might need several friends and relatives so that we can call on different people for different things. So who can I call on for feeling depressed or anxious? Who can I call if I'm feeling lonely? Some of us have another part of this plan is the list of people we should avoid. So people not to ring or contact when we're feeling like we're having a hard time. Maybe because they might be judgmental, or maybe I have one of those friends who's like hyper positive. So you know that if you ring them, you get about 20 seconds before they're turning the negative into a positive, and it just takes me longer than that. So they're good at times, and they're not so good at other times. It also makes you draw up a list of the things to avoid. So behaviors and activities that will just continue to make you feel down or flat. I should not listen to sad music, should not drink too much alcohol. I should not stay in bed all day. Although sometimes staying in bed all day is the appropriate response. So it also suggests that you make a small card and you keep these activities close at hand. Obviously, that's you might want to have that on your desk if you're working through some particularly difficult cases. So I brought you back to the mental health wheel because that self-care plan, you're looking at engaging with all of the different aspects from that wheel. So if you sit down and undertake that activity, you want to have a look at getting things from all different aspects of your life onto your self-care plan. And finally, I also wanted to acknowledge that our world is changing very, very fast. And there's this emerging technology in what we call worry trackers or mood trackers. And so I have to confess to being slightly ignorant of this until very recently. And I came across one and I thought, oh, that's good, I'll download that and see how that works. And then if you Google mood trackers, there's tens of them. So there are lots and lots of different apps that you can use to monitor your mood. And the reason they've become popular is because monitoring your mood helps prevent a low mood. So when you know how your mood ebbs and flows, when you're monitoring it, you're thinking, you're reflecting, and then you're inadvertently actively working to support your mood rather than allowing it to get on top of you. So my last slide is really about making time. So many of us have extremely busy lives with lots of people wanting all of your time, and you feel like there's no time. And the app says, get more sleep. And you're just kind of like, when would I do that? Would that be like between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m.? Have a cup of tea. It's like, I'm not sure I can do that. But it's so very important. So there are some very short, quick things that you can do to help yourself manage pressures and anxiety that come through work, and take the time to do them. I haven't really covered breathing exercises, meditation, all of those things are really healthy to support your mental well-being. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. does anybody have any, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through Vicarious Trauma and self-care. There are resources in the hub for you, and there's lots of material out there now. I think COVID-19 has just prompted a huge flurry of apps and information and useful strategies. So does anybody have any questions for me? Here we go. Okay. So there's one question. Okay, I have a supporting observation. Well, okay, would you like to make a supporting observation? So I think everyone can read the typing. So we're talking about the 2012 Queensland floods. Okay. Okay, so I think I can preempt what you're going to say. Loss adjusters couldn't handle the interview. Well, I'm not surprised, is my answer to that. And oh, they ran out. Okay. I mean, this situation would not, it's not good, but it wouldn't be that unusual. When I reflect on my time as a young police officer, and I certainly wasn't the youngest person to join the police force, but I reflect now on the situations that I was responding to and expected, and police are expected to respond to those situations now. And there, I don't know if there's any training that can equip you with the skills that you need to deal with some people's loss. So it may be that situation like that you're talking about, where loss adjusters not having the skills, they probably didn't have any training. I recognize that. Obviously, today you would hope that they would have that training. But even if they did have that training, it may be that in that particular situation with that particular family, they couldn't deal with the situation, and maybe running out was the only way that they could personally cope with that. It reminds me of a story about my own policing experience. That I was only a cop for 5 years in England, so not a long time, and I never dealt with anything really gruesome. Certainly know lots of police that have dealt with incidents that are vastly more extreme than anything I ever had to deal with. But one of the there was an incident that I dealt with that left me, to this day, it brings a tear to my eye. Somehow it just was a trigger for something, and obviously it's connected. I can see now it's connected with the impact of other people's trauma, and it was a sudden death, and you deal with lots of sudden deaths. It was a natural sudden death, so it wasn't anything difficult really. But the complicating situation around it is that I was a local bobby, so I was the first one to attend. But unfortunately, the gentleman who had died was aged about 50. He'd had a heart attack, but he'd been found by his 12-year-old son. And I had to spend hours in that house with them and his 12-year-old son and his 8-year-old daughter, who arrived shortly after the son, and they'd be their mother. Oh, excuse me. So very difficult to even talk about today. But unfortunately, their mother had died 6 months before their father, so they were now orphaned. And that event, that incident, still creates this response to me today, which has to be some 25 years later. So these feelings are very deep in us, and different things will cause different problems for different people. So if there are any other questions, I take it that there probably aren't. So yes, so at the risk of self-promoting, I offer professional supervision and support to investigators. Well, I think that's terrific, actually, Wendy. And if you want to email me information, I will certainly pass that on, because I think it's really important, and it's yeah, I just think it's a really important thing for us to do for ourselves. Okay. So I'll wrap up that session, and for those of you who would like to join us, we're going to have an open meeting where we can actually talk to each other rather than having to type, starting at 5, which must be right now, and we'll just go until people have had enough. If you don't want to join in that session, that's perfectly fine, and thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed the day.